My name is Fiona and I am 33 years old. I emptied my entire life savings to buy a rundown gas station that had been abandoned since 1992. The day I signed the contract, my parents looked at me with absolute disgust. Entire logistical system. I saved the company millions of dollars in operational acquisition. Instead of reading it, he had simply deleted my name from the title slide and replaced it with his own. I sat frozen in my heavy leather chair, the leather squeaking slightly as I gripped the armrests. I was forced to sit there in silence, listening to my brother confidently pitch 3 years of my blood, sweat, and tears as his own strategic master plan. He pointed to a graph tracking diesel fuel costs, completely misidentifying the supply chain metrics that I had spent weeks formulating. He called our freight vendors by the wrong corporate names. It was a disaster of a presentation to anyone who actually understood the logistics industry. But he possessed enough manufactured charm and family confidence to fake his way through the room. The investors nodded along, thoroughly impressed by the bold new direction he was proposing. I looked over at my father, expecting him to intervene to stop this blatant theft and correct the record. Instead, Harrison was beaming with radiant pride. He looked at Cameron with the exact expression of admiration and respect that I had spent my entire life desperately wishing he would direct toward me. When the presentation finally concluded, the conference room erupted into enthusiastic applause. My father stood up, walking over to place a heavy, approving hand on Cameron's shoulder. He cleared his throat to make an official announcement. Based on this phenomenal restructuring and the incredible vision shown here today, I am thrilled to officially name Cameron as our new Vice President of Operations. The room clapped louder. Cameron flashed a brilliant rehearsed smile and began shaking hands with the investors, soaking up the praise and adoration he absolutely did not earn. I felt physically sick, my stomach churning with a mixture of profound humiliation and intense anger. The promotion I had sacrificed my youth and personal life for was being handed away right in front of me, treated as a participation trophy for the son who simply showed up. As soon as the investors cleared out of the conference room and the hallways emptied, I marched straight into my father's private office. I closed the heavy glass door behind me, ensuring no one could hear us. My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to stand tall. "Dad, you cannot do this," I said, keeping my voice as steady and forceful as possible. That was my presentation. I did all the work. I ran the numbers, I negotiated the contracts, and I built that entire system from scratch. You promised me the vice president position months ago. My father did not even have the decency to look guilty or caught. He simply sat down behind his massive desk, steepled his fingers, and looked at me with mild annoyance. "Fiona, lower your voice. You are being hysterical." Cameron presented a brilliant strategy today, and the board loved his delivery. "He just read my slides," I shot back, taking a step closer to his desk. "He does not even know how the routing software works." If an investor had asked him a single technical question, the entire presentation would have collapsed. I saved this company from bankruptcy, not him. My father let out a long, patronizing sigh, the kind of sigh reserved for a misbehaving child. "Fiona, you need to look at the bigger picture here. You are a great logistics manager, and we deeply value your behind-the-scenes work. You are good with the details. But Cameron has the charisma. He has the executive presence. He is the face of the legacy. People out there want to do business with him. They want to shake his hand. You are just too emotional right now to understand how corporate optics work. We need you to be a team player. If you keep your head down, manage the day-to-day operations, and keep supporting your brother, maybe we can discuss a small bonus at the end of the fiscal year." A team player. That was his code word for staying in my lane, doing the heavy lifting in the shadows, and letting the men in the family take all the public glory and financial reward. In that exact moment, looking across the polished wood of his desk, the invisible string that had kept me tied to their approval completely snapped. I looked at my father, really looked at him, and realized with absolute chilling clarity that I would never win in this family. There was no amount of money I could save them, no amount of late nights I could work, and no level of success I could achieve that would ever make them see me as anything other than Cameron's support staff. My entire existence in their eyes was to facilitate his success. I did not scream. I did not cry or beg for what was rightfully mine. I simply nodded, turned around, and walked out of his office without another word. I went straight to my cubicle and began methodically packing my personal belongings into a cardboard box. I did not look at my colleagues or explain my actions as I carried my things to the elevator. Over the next 48 hours, I operated with a cold, calculated precision that left no room for doubt or hesitation. I went to my bank and quietly emptied my entire life savings account. I logged into my brokerage portal and liquidated my modest stock portfolio, selling off every single share I had slowly and carefully accumulated over my adult years. I gathered every dollar I had to my name, ignoring the frantic warnings of financial advisors. I knew exactly what I was going to do. I was going to build my own independent logistics hub, and I was going to do it without a single cent of my family's money or influence. I drove out to the dusty, forgotten outskirts of town, miles away from my family's pristine commercial properties and luxury developments. I met with a bewildered local real estate agent inside a sweltering diner. I did not hesitate as I signed the heavy stack of paperwork to purchase a dilapidated, rusted property that had been abandoned since 1992. It was an old, weather-beaten gas station, sitting on a massive, neglected lot covered in overgrown weeds, broken glass, and cracked asphalt. The paint on the main building was peeling off in large strips. The metal canopy over the pumps was sagging dangerously, and the convenience store windows were caked in decades of hardened grime. It looked like a financial nightmare, a complete dead end that commercial developers had ignored for 30 years. But I knew the local geography perfectly. I knew the interstate expansion was planned several miles away, and I also knew this old route was a heavily trafficked secondary artery for independent truckers. With the right investment and a lot of elbow grease, I could transform this abandoned plot into a vital logistical way station and dispatch center. As I stood there holding the deed to my new property, feeling the hot wind kick up dust around my ankles, it looked like absolute freedom. I was finally the owner of my own destiny, completely severed from the toxic shadow of my brother and the suffocating control of my father. The following Sunday evening, I walked into the most exclusive downtown steakhouse for our mandatory family dinner. The restaurant was a fortress of dark mahogany wood, dim, ambient lighting, and soft jazz playing in the background. It was the kind of place where waiters wore white gloves, and a single appetizer cost more than most people made in an entire day of hard labor. The contrast between this opulent world and the gritty reality I had just chosen for myself was staggering. My parents and Cameron were already seated at our usual expansive corner booth. They were sharing a $300 bottle of Cabernet, loudly celebrating Cameron's newly stolen promotion. I stood at the edge of the table for a moment, taking in the scene before me. My mother Barbara was adorned in her signature pearls, looking perfectly manicured, and deeply bored by anything that did not directly involve her social standing. My father Harrison was holding court, gesturing widely with his expensive wine glass, as he detailed his future visions for the company. Cameron sat across from them, looking incredibly smug and entitled, wearing a watch that cost more than my entire annual salary. I slid into the empty leather seat, my purse resting heavily on my lap. Inside that purse was my entire future, and my heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Harrison did not even bother to greet me properly. He immediately looked at his gold watch, noting I was exactly 4 minutes late, and then shifted straight into business mode. He commanded me to have the comprehensive quarterly logistics reports sitting on Cameron's desk by 8 in the morning on Monday. He stated that my brother needed ample time to review my numbers before his first official executive luncheon. I did not nod. I did not agree. I did not offer my usual compliant smile. Instead, I reached into my purse and pulled out a crisp white envelope. I slid it across the white linen tablecloth directly in front of my father. I looked him dead in the eye and told him he would not be getting any reports from me on Monday or ever again. I told him that envelope contained my formal letter of resignation, effective immediately. The table went completely silent. The cheerful clinking of silverware abruptly stopped. Harrison stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake. Barbara let out a sharp theatrical gasp, her hand flying to her chest in mock horror. Cameron just looked confused, his arrogant smile faltering for a fraction of a second. My father finally found his voice, his tone low, harsh, and dangerous. He demanded to know what kind of childish tantrum I was throwing in a public place. He warned me that if I walked out that door, I would be throwing away a guaranteed comfortable career under my brother's brilliant leadership. I did not flinch. I reached into my purse a second time and pulled out the thick notarized deed to the abandoned gas station. I placed it squarely on top of my resignation letter. I told my father I was officially done building their massive empire while they treated me like a disposable servant. I announced that I had purchased my own commercial property and I was going to build an independent logistics hub entirely on my own terms. Cameron reached over and snatched the deed off the table before my father could even touch it. He scanned the address, his brow furrowing as he tried to mentally map the location. When he finally realized where the property was situated, he threw his head back and burst into loud theatrical laughter. The sound echoed abrasively through the quiet restaurant, drawing annoyed stares from the wealthy diners at adjacent tables. He slammed his hand on the table, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye. He asked if I had completely lost my mind. Cameron loudly mocked my purchase, broadcasting to the entire dining room that I had dumped my life savings into a toxic dirt patch on the absolute worst edge of town. He called the property a rusted environmental nightmare that had been completely dead for 30 years. He leaned across the table, a cruel smirk twisting his features, and called me a hopeless failure. He told me I had zero business acumen, no strategic vision, and that without the family name backing me up, I would be utterly bankrupt and begging for my old cubicle within a single month. He laughed again, tossing the deed back at me like it was a worthless piece of garbage. My mother did not defend me. She did not express a single ounce of maternal concern for my well-being or my future. Instead, she sighed dramatically, looking around the restaurant with frantic embarrassment to see who was watching us. She leaned in close to the table, her voice a harsh, venomous whisper. She told me I was an absolute embarrassment to their elite social circle. She demanded to know how she was supposed to explain this humiliating career move to her friends at the country club. She explicitly forbade me from ever mentioning this trashy venture to anyone in their network. She stated that the very idea of a woman from our distinguished family operating a filthy abandoned gas station was a total humiliation that she would not tolerate. She looked at me with pure, unadulterated disgust. Then my father delivered the final crushing blow. The faint amusement had vanished from his face, replaced by a cold, calculating fury. He told me that if I wanted to play business owner with a rusted pump and a patch of dead weeds, I was going to do it completely on my own. He officially fired me from the family firm right then and there, stripping away my title and my security. But he did not stop there. He coldly informed me that he was severing my access to the family trust immediately. He declared that I would not see another dime of their money, not a single cent of future inheritance, and that my company health insurance would be terminated by midnight. He told me I was dead to the firm and dead to the family legacy. He crossed his arms and stared at me, fully expecting me to break down, to cry, to beg for my job back, and apologize for my defiance. I simply looked back at him, my jaw clenched tight, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a single tear. The tension at the table was thick and suffocating. Just then, our waiter nervously approached and placed a heavy black leather folder containing the dinner check in the center of the table. Cameron intercepted it smoothly. He opened the folder, glanced at the massive total, and then looked directly at me. His smirk widened into a malicious, triumphant grin. He picked up the leather folder and dropped it right onto my lap. "Welcome to the real world, boss," Cameron sneered. "Consider this your first independent business expense." Without another word, Cameron Harrison and Barbara stood up from the booth. They did not look back. They did not say goodbye or offer a single word of caution. I sat frozen in the booth and watched my family walk out the heavy glass doors of the steakhouse, abandoning me completely. I was entirely alone. I slowly opened the leather folder resting on my lap. The bill for their extravagant imported wine, their premium dry-aged steaks, and their decadent desserts came to exactly $840. My hands shook violently as I pulled my phone out of my purse and opened my mobile banking application. I stared at the bright screen, the numbers blurring slightly through the unshed tears stinging my eyes. I had poured every liquid asset I had into purchasing the gas station and paying the closing costs. My checking account balance currently sat at exactly $400. I had one emergency credit card left in my wallet with a meager $500 limit. I was terrified. The sheer gravity of my situation crashed down on me, threatening to pull me under. I had no job, no health insurance, no family safety net, and I was about to max out my last line of credit just to pay for a meal I barely ate. The physical sensation of impending poverty hit me hard, making my chest tight and my breathing shallow. But as I pulled that plastic credit card from my wallet to cover my family's final parting insult, the terror morphed into something else entirely. It hardened into a deep, unbreakable resolve. They wanted me to fail. They expected me to come crawling back broken and desperate, ready to accept my place in Cameron's shadow forever. But as I signed that receipt, leaving myself with absolutely nothing to fall back on, I made a silent, sacred vow to myself. I was going to turn that toxic dirt patch into an empire, and I was going to make them regret the day they ever underestimated me. The very next morning, I packed my entire life into the trunk of my 10-year-old sedan and drove straight to the property. I had officially moved into the gas station. There was no grand welcoming committee and no ribbon-cutting ceremony. There was only the suffocating smell of stale motor oil rat droppings and 3 decades of uninterrupted rot. The convenience store windows were completely opaque with thick layers of yellowed grime. Inside the main building, the air was incredibly heavy. The eccentric previous owner had been a man named Silas. He died a few years ago with absolutely no heirs and a severe hoarding problem. Silas had apparently used the property as a personal dumping ground for his entire adult life. I set up a cheap canvas military cot in what used to be the manager's back office. The floor was covered in cracked linoleum, and the walls were severely stained with nicotine. I had no running water for the first 3 days, and my only source of electricity was a noisy portable generator I bought secondhand. I woke up every single morning before dawn, my muscles screaming in protest from the freezing cold nights spent on that unforgiving cot. I drank instant coffee from a thermos and immediately got to work. It was physically brutal labor. I dragged heavy rusted car parts out into the blazing sun. I hauled massive garbage bags filled with decaying magazines, shattered glass bottles, and completely unidentifiable debris out to the rented dumpsters sitting on the cracked asphalt. My hands were soon covered in angry red blisters, and my lungs constantly burned from the thick clouds of disturbed dust. I was completely exhausted, but I refused to stop. Every time I felt like collapsing, I just remembered the sound of my brother laughing at the restaurant, and the sight of my father looking at me with pure disdain. That memory was pure rocket fuel. It kept me swinging, lifting, and hauling until my vision blurred. I was systematically clearing out the physical manifestation of my family's low expectations. By the end of the first grueling week, I had managed to clear the main retail floor and the garage bays. I finally moved my attention to the back storage room. This space was in the absolute worst condition. A severe roof leak from years ago had caused extensive damage to the ceiling and the back wall. The drywall was swollen, covered in thick black mold, and practically crumbling onto the floor in large, disgusting heaps. I knew I needed to tear it all down to check the structural wooden framing for dry rot before I could even think about hiring a contractor for renovations. I put on a heavy-duty respirator mask, grabbed my 12-pound sledgehammer, and squared up against the ruined wall. The summer heat inside that unventilated room was absolutely oppressive. Sweat poured down my forehead, stinging my eyes and soaking my shirt, but I raised the heavy hammer over my shoulder and swung it forward with every ounce of frustration I had left in my body. I wanted to demolish everything that reminded me of my past. The hammer smashed through the brittle, moldy drywall with a satisfying crunch. Chunks of white plaster and gray dust exploded outward, raining down on my heavy work boots. I pulled the hammer back and swung again, aiming slightly lower to clear a larger section. But this time, the impact was entirely different. Instead of the dull, hollow thud of smashing plaster, or the splintering crack of hitting a wooden stud, a massive, deafening metallic clang echoed through the cramped storage room. The violent vibration shot straight up the wooden handle of the sledgehammer, rattling my bones and nearly jarring my teeth loose. I dropped the hammer to the concrete floor, my hands stinging and numb from the intense shockwave. I stepped closer to the gaping hole in the wall, waving away the thick cloud of plaster dust to get a better look. What I saw made my heart skip a beat. Hidden completely behind the layer of cheap water-damaged drywall was a massive solid steel plate. I grabbed a crowbar from my tool belt and frantically began ripping away the surrounding sections of the ruined wall. I tore down sheets of plaster with my bare hands, ignoring the sharp splinters scraping against my knuckles. As the false wall crumbled away, the sheer scale of my discovery was slowly revealed in the dim light. It was not just a steel plate. It was a massive commercial-grade fireproof walk-in vault. It was seamlessly integrated into the original concrete foundation of the building, purposefully hidden away from prying eyes for decades. The heavy steel door was painted a dull industrial gray, and right in the center sat a complex, heavily rusted combination dial and a thick horizontal locking handle. I stood there staring at the imposing metal structure, my mind racing with a million different questions. Silas was supposedly just a quirky local land surveyor who ran a failing gas station. Why on earth would a man like that need a bank-grade security vault hidden behind a fake wall in his storage room? I immediately pulled out my phone and searched for the most experienced commercial locksmith in the county. I found a man named Hank, a gruff retired military contractor who specialized in cracking antique safes. I told him it was an absolute emergency and promised to pay his exorbitant rush fee in cash. Hank arrived at the property 2 hours later, driving a battered utility van. He walked into the storage room, took one look at the massive steel door, and let out a low whistle of appreciation. He told me that this specific model was a custom-built stronghold from the late 70s designed to survive a direct blast. He unpacked a series of highly specialized tools, including a medical stethoscope and a magnetic drill rig, and got straight to work on the rusted dial. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. I paced back and forth across the dusty linoleum floor, watching Hank manipulate the rusted mechanism with intense precision. The hours dragged on relentlessly. The heat inside the room grew even more unbearable. My anxiety spiked with every minute that ticked by. What if it was completely empty? What if Silas had just been paranoid and locked away nothing but old tax returns and useless junk? I had bet my absolute last dollar on this property, and right now my entire future depended on whatever was waiting on the other side of that steel barrier. I could not afford to be wrong. I had burned every single bridge with my family, and I had no safety net left to catch me if I fell. Suddenly, a loud, heavy mechanical click resonated from inside the door. Hank stepped back, wiping a thick layer of sweat from his forehead with the back of his grease-stained hand. He looked at me, a triumphant grin spreading across his weathered face. He grabbed the thick steel handle, braced his heavy boots against the concrete floor, and pulled with all his might. The internal locking bolts ground together with a harsh metallic screech, protesting loudly after 30 years of total inactivity. Slowly, inch by inch, the massive steel door groaned open. A rush of cool, perfectly preserved stale air washed over my face. I stepped past Hank, pulled a heavy-duty flashlight from my belt, and walked straight into the pitch-black darkness of the hidden vault. What I saw waiting for me inside the shadows was about to change the trajectory of my entire life. My flashlight beam cut through the pitch-black darkness, sweeping across the expansive interior of the hidden vault. The air inside was completely different from the sweltering, moldy storage room behind me. It was cool, incredibly dry, and carried a faint metallic scent. Silas had somehow installed a passive moisture control system that had miraculously survived the decades, keeping the atmosphere perfectly preserved. But it was not the ingenious architecture that made my jaw drop. It was the contents. The vault was not filled with stacks of cash gold bars or traditional valuables. Instead, the heavy steel shelving units lining the concrete walls were packed with carefully preserved history. Thick padded moving blankets and heavy layers of industrial plastic wrap protected dozens of massive objects. I stepped forward, my heavy work boots echoing loudly in the silent space, and carefully pulled back the heavy plastic from the nearest shelf. Brilliant, flawless neon colors reflected in the beam of my flashlight. I was staring at a massive mint condition, 1950s porcelain enamel automotive sign. The cherry red Pegasus of a vintage mobile gas station gleamed as if it had been manufactured yesterday. I moved down the row frantically, pulling back blanket after blanket. The vault contained an absolute treasure trove of flawless Americana. There were towering Texaco star signs, pristine Sinclair dinosaur marquee, displays glowing neon diner clocks, and dozens of heavy chrome hood ornaments still resting in their original deteriorating cardboard boxes. Silas had not just been throwing garbage into his yard. He had been quietly, obsessively curating and protecting a museum-quality collection of automotive history while the world above ground completely forgot about him. I stood in the center of the vault, my mind calculating the sheer magnitude of what I had just uncovered. I knew from my years in commercial logistics that pristine vintage industrial art held massive value among wealthy private collectors, but I needed a professional to tell me exactly how much leverage I had just acquired. I could not risk going to a public auction house or a local dealer. If my father or Cameron caught wind that I had suddenly come into money, they would use their corporate lawyers to bury me in frivolous property disputes just to drain my resources. I needed someone discreet, someone who operated outside of my family's elite, suffocating social circles. Sitting on my military cot that evening, I used my phone to research independent high-end Americana brokers. I found a man named Victor, who operated a private brokerage out of a neighboring state, catering exclusively to wealthy anonymous buyers who furnished massive private garages and private museums. I sent him 3 high-resolution photographs of the largest porcelain signs and told him I required a fully confidential on-site appraisal. Victor arrived 2 days later driving an unmarked luxury transport van. He stepped into the hidden vault, put on a pair of white cotton inspection gloves, and went completely silent. For 3 agonizing hours, he moved through the collection with a high-powered magnifying glass and a digital caliper. He inspected the enamel thickness, the mounting grommets, and the neon tubing, treating every single piece like it was a fragile crown jewel. When he finally stepped back out into the sweltering heat of the main garage, he looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated awe. He told me that in his 30 years of brokering, he had never seen a private cache this extensive and this immaculately preserved. The fact that the porcelain had been shielded from sunlight and moisture meant there was zero fading and zero rust. He pulled a slim tablet from his briefcase, ran some rapid calculations, and looked me dead in the eye. He stated that the entire collection, if broken up and sold to the right private buyers, would easily command over $600,000. The number hit me like a physical shockwave. $600,000. Just a few days ago, I was staring at a restaurant bill I could barely afford, terrified of starving. Now I was standing on top of a massive financial war chest. I did not hesitate. I told Victor I needed immediate liquid capital to fund a major commercial renovation. I offered him a generous commission on the total collection provided he could wire me an immediate non-refundable advance for the most valuable pieces today. Victor agreed on the spot. He drafted a binding brokerage contract from his tablet. Less than an hour later, I sat in the dusty office of my gas station and watched my mobile banking application refresh. A wire transfer of $250,000 landed squarely in my checking account. The suffocating, paralyzing terror of poverty vanished instantly. I had my ammunition. I had the capital to completely rebuild this property, to hire the best contractors, and to bring my independent logistics hub to life. After Victor carefully packed the first batch of signs into his climate-controlled transport van and drove away, I returned to the vault to begin taking a detailed inventory of the remaining pieces. I was moving a stack of heavy cast-iron vintage license plates from the bottom shelf when my boot struck something hard, hidden in the deepest, darkest corner of the steel room. I crouched down and aimed my flashlight into the tight space. Wedged firmly beneath the heavy steel framing of the bottom shelf was a battered olive-green metal lockbox. It looked like an old military surplus ammunition crate, sealed shut with a heavy brass padlock. The lock was thick with a strange white oxidation, indicating it had not been touched in decades. I grabbed my heavy steel crowbar from the main floor, wedged the hooked end directly behind the brass lock, and threw my entire body weight into the metal bar. The old padlock snapped with a sharp crack, falling heavily to the concrete floor. I pulled the metal lid open fully, expecting to find stacks of old silver certificates or perhaps some eccentric personal journals. Instead, the box was packed tightly with thick, yellowed legal folders bound in dry, brittle twine. I lifted the heavy stack out of the box and carried it into the office, spreading the documents across a folding plastic table I had set up near my cot. I turned on my battery-powered desk lamp and carefully untied the twine. The documents were original typewritten legal contracts dating back to the late 1980s. Silas had not just owned the 2-acre plot where the gas station sat. According to these perfectly preserved, grandfathered in commercial deeds, Silas had systematically exploited a massive blind spot in the local municipal zoning laws decades ago. When the surrounding town experienced a severe economic downturn in the 80s, the local government had desperately liquidated vast tracts of undeveloped land to balance their municipal budget. Everyone assumed the dusty, rocky valley surrounding the gas station was completely barren and worthless. But Silas was a land surveyor. He knew the topography better than any city planner. He knew that the valley sat directly over a massive, pristine subterranean aquifer. The documents in my hands proved that Silas had quietly purchased the exclusive, irrevocable water and mineral rights for the entire 800-acre valley surrounding my property. I sat back in my cheap folding chair, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I read the clauses again, tracing the typewritten ink with my finger to make sure I was not hallucinating. Because the city had completely written off the land they sold the subterranean rights for absolute pennies. And crucially, Silas had structured the purchase so that these exclusive rights ran directly with the title of the gas station property itself. By purchasing the deed to the gas station, I had legally inherited the absolute undisputed control over the water table for the entire surrounding region. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. In commercial real estate development, controlling the water rights is the ultimate trump card. Any developer who wanted to build anything substantial in that 800-acre basin would be entirely legally dependent on whoever held these documents. They could not drill a well, they could not lay municipal piping, they could not build a single foundation without securing my explicit, legally binding authorization. I was no longer just a woman trying to renovate an old gas station. I held the absolute lifeblood of the entire valley securely in my hands. The universe had not just handed me a second chance. It had handed me the keys to a kingdom. I secured the irreplaceable water deeds inside a heavy plastic sleeve and locked them back inside the fireproof vault. Less than 48 hours later, the universe delivered the exact reason those documents were so incredibly valuable. I was sitting at my plastic folding table, drinking bitter coffee and reviewing contractor bids for the canopy repair when my laptop chimed with a breaking news alert. It was a live stream from the local business journal. The headline read that my family's commercial real estate firm was announcing the largest development project in the history of the county. I clicked the link and watched as the video buffered, revealing a massive stage set up in the grand ballroom of a downtown luxury hotel. My father stood at the podium looking immensely proud, but it was Cameron who took center stage. He wore a crisp navy suit and smiled brightly for the flashing cameras. behind him, a massive digital screen illuminated the room with a high-definition three-dimensional architectural rendering. Cameron proudly announced the launch of Oasis Valley. It was a $250 million luxury eco-resort and exclusive gated community. He pointed a laser pointer at the screen, highlighting the sweeping golf courses, the cascading waterfall entrances, and three massive artificial lakes that would serve as the centerpiece for million-dollar waterfront estates. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding a steady rhythm against my ribs. I recognized the topography instantly. The sweeping digital rendering showed the exact 800-acre valley that completely surrounded my rusted gas station. Cameron spoke eloquently about sustainable luxury and creating a desert oasis for the ultra-wealthy. The sheer blinding hubris of their plan was staggering. They were pre-selling millions of dollars in luxury waterfront plots without actually doing fundamental due diligence. They had clearly assumed that because the valley had sat barren for 3 decades, the subterranean rights had simply reverted to the municipal government. They believed they could just buy the surface dirt and drill their wells with a rubber-stamped city permit. They had absolutely no idea that the water table belonged entirely to me. By the end of the week, I had put my newly acquired cash advance to work. I hired a crew of heavy machinery operators to tear up the cracked asphalt and begin grading the lot. The air was thick with the smell of diesel exhaust and freshly turned earth. I was standing near the old service bays wearing a bright yellow hard hat and a high-visibility vest, reviewing a blueprint with my site foreman. The roar of a luxury engine suddenly cut through the noise of the construction equipment. A sleek, silver Porsche Panamera turned sharply off the main highway and rolled onto my property, its low carriage scraping aggressively against a chunk of broken concrete. The driver's side door swung open and Cameron stepped out. He was wearing expensive Italian leather loafers and a tailored linen suit that looked completely absurd amidst the dust and heavy machinery. He pinched the bridge of his nose, waving his hand in front of his face, as a cloud of dirt washed over his expensive clothes. I watched him take in the scene. I could see the exact moment the geographical reality registered in his brain. His eyes darted from the property line of my gas station to the sprawling, empty valley stretching out behind it. He suddenly realized the catastrophic logistical problem my existence posed to his grand vision. My property sat squarely at the absolute bottleneck entrance of the valley. There was no other access road. Every single luxury SUV, every wealthy investor, and every elite country club member heading to the pristine gates of Oasis Valley would be forced to drive directly past my loud industrial heavy-duty logistics hub. I was a massive visual and operational blight on his $250 million masterpiece. He slammed his car door shut and marched directly toward me, his face twisted in a mixture of profound annoyance and aggressive superiority. I dismissed my foreman and crossed my arms, waiting for my brother to speak. Cameron stopped a few feet away, looking me up and down with an expression of pure pity. He shook his head slowly, clicking his tongue, as if he were looking at a tragic accident. He told me that the family had given me a few weeks to throw my little tantrum, but now the joke was officially over. He said it was time for me to pack up my camping gear, take a shower, and return to reality. He reached inside his tailored jacket and pulled out a slim, leather-bound checkbook. He unscrewed a gold fountain pen and held it poised over the paper. Cameron adopted the sickeningly sweet, patronizing tone he always used when he thought he was holding all the cards. He told me that Dad was still furious, but that he was willing to play the benevolent older brother and bail me out of this embarrassing mess. He offered to write me a certified check for $50,000 right on the spot. He claimed the property was a toxic environmental hazard and completely worthless, but he was willing to take the loss just to save me from the inevitable bankruptcy that was rapidly approaching. He extended the pen toward me, ordering me to sign the deed over to his holding company so I could salvage what little dignity I had left. I looked at the silver pen, then I looked at the checkbook, and finally I looked directly into my brother's eyes. I did not get angry. I did not yell or act defensive. Instead, a genuine hearty laugh erupted from my chest. The sound was loud and bright, echoing over the rumble of the nearby bulldozers. I laughed so hard I had to wipe a tear from the corner of my eye. Cameron's patronizing smile instantly vanished, replaced by a look of sheer confused indignation. I stepped forward, pushing the pen away from my face. I told him $50,000 would not even cover the cost of the new commercial canopy I was installing next week. I informed him that my property was not for sale to him, not for 50,000, not for 50 million, and certainly not for the preservation of his fragile ego. The facade of the caring, successful older brother completely shattered. Cameron's face turned a deep, mottled shade of crimson. The charm evaporated, leaving behind the vicious, entitled bully I had known my entire life. He stepped aggressively into my personal space, pointing a manicured finger directly at my chest. His voice dropped into a low, threatening snarl. He told me I had absolutely no idea who I was messing with. He bragged that he and our father had the mayor, the zoning commission, and the entire city council sitting comfortably in their back pockets. Cameron explicitly threatened to weaponize his political connections against me. He swore that if I did not take the $50,000 and walk away today, he would have the city council condemn my property via eminent domain before the end of the month. He promised to launch a barrage of environmental inspections, structural audits, and legal injunctions that would bury me so deep in legal fees I would be living on the streets. He sneered, stating that I was nothing but a pathetic dropout trying to play a rich man's game, and that he would take immense pleasure in crushing my little rebellion into the dirt. I did not take a single step back. I held my ground, meeting his furious glare with absolute ice-cold composure. I told him he was trespassing on an active commercial construction site and ordered him to get off my property immediately before I had my crew physically remove his vehicle. Cameron let out a harsh barking laugh, promising me I would severely regret this conversation. He turned on his heel, stormed back to his Porsche, and slammed the door with enough force to shake the windows. He threw the car into reverse, spinning his expensive tires in the dirt and gravel as he sped back onto the highway, leaving a thick cloud of dust in his wake. I stood there watching his taillights disappear into the distance. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the heavy brass key to the hidden vault. I smiled broadly into the dusty wind. Cameron thought he held the entire world in his hands, but he had absolutely no idea about the catastrophic legal trap he had just blindly walked into. Cameron and my father did not waste a single second making good on their threats. At exactly 8 in the morning on the very next day, a fleet of white municipal vehicles pulled onto the freshly graded dirt of my property. 5 city inspectors stepped out, all wearing identical expressions of bureaucratic indifference and carrying thick clipboards. They did not introduce themselves or ask for the property owner. They simply fanned out across the site and began issuing citations with a speed and coordination that was entirely unnatural for local government workers. I walked over to the lead inspector, a short man with a clipboard who refused to make eye contact with me. I asked him what was going on and why my construction crew was being ordered to halt their work. He handed me a stack of yellow carbon copy papers without a word. The citations were completely absurd. I was being fined for the placement of a temporary dumpster. I was cited for the distance between the portable toilets and the property line. They dug up obscure municipal codes from the 1970s, citing the angle of the rusted canopy and the type of gravel used near the old pumps. One citation actually claimed the weeds on the far edge of the property constituted an illegal environmental hazard. By the end of that first hour, I had accumulated over $10,000 in municipal fines. The lead inspector smugly informed me that a stop work order had been placed on my entire renovation project. He stated that no heavy machinery could operate on the premises until every single violation was rectified and re-inspected by the city zoning board. A board that I knew for a fact was chaired by one of my father's oldest golfing buddies. It was a perfectly executed, weaponized bureaucratic strike designed to bleed my remaining capital dry and force me into submission. But the harassment did not stop with the city inspectors. When the legal intimidation failed to make me pack my bags and run, my family escalated their tactics to outright sabotage. A few days after the stop work order was issued, I woke up in the pitch black of night to the sound of shattering glass. I grabbed a heavy metal flashlight from beside my cot and sprinted out of the back office. The heavy silence of the night was broken only by the sound of tires screeching as a truck sped away down the highway. I stepped out onto the asphalt and scanned the property. The newly installed chain link fence surrounding the perimeter had been methodically cut open in 3 different places, the heavy metal wire snipped with industrial bolt cutters. The large convenience store windows, which my crew had spent 2 entire days carefully cleaning and restoring, were completely smashed. Shards of thick safety glass covered the ground, glittering like ice in the beam of my flashlight. Someone had hurled heavy bricks through every single pane. The next morning, the situation grew even more desperate. My contractor arrived to assess the broken windows and discovered that we had absolutely no running water. I walked out to the main line near the street and found a massive, freshly dug hole. A bright orange sign from the city water department stood in the dirt, claiming that emergency maintenance was required on the main valve. When I called the city to demand an explanation, a board clerk informed me that the maintenance was scheduled to take an indefinite amount of time due to unforeseen infrastructural complexities. 2 days later, my power was cut. A municipal utility truck parked at the edge of my lot. A worker climbed the pole and disconnected my connection to the grid. The official excuse was that my temporary construction generator posed a fire hazard to the local power lines and required a comprehensive safety audit before grid access could be restored. Without water, without power, and with a stop work order paralyzing my crew, my renovation ground to an absolute agonizing halt. The financial strain was immense. I was paying contractors who could not legally swing a hammer. I was burning through diesel fuel just to keep a smaller secondary generator running so I could have a single light bulb in my office. My family was systematically suffocating my business before it even had a chance to open its doors. They expected me to panic. They expected me to call them in tears begging for forgiveness and accepting Cameron's pathetic $50,000 buyout just to escape the nightmare they had manufactured. Instead of breaking, the targeted harassment only hardened my resolve into something unbreakable. Every shattered window, every bogus fine, and every severed utility line simply proved how absolutely terrified they were of my presence. They knew they needed my land for their $250 million resort, and they were willing to play incredibly dirty to get it. I decided it was time to play dirty right back, but I was going to do it with undeniable proof. I used a portion of my liquid cash to purchase a dozen high-definition motion-activated trail cameras. These were the kind of discreet, weather-resistant cameras used by professional hunters, designed to blend completely into the environment and capture crystal-clear footage in total darkness. I waited until the dead of night, slipping through the shadows of my own property to install them. I mounted cameras high up in the dense branches of the old oak trees bordering the highway. I hid them inside the hollowed-out shells of the broken gas pumps. I positioned them to cover every possible angle of the property line, the main office, and the utility connections at the street. I turned the back office into a surveillance hub. I bought a high-capacity hard drive and began meticulously documenting every single interaction on the property. When the city inspectors returned to issue another round of fabricated code violations, my hidden cameras captured their license plates, their badge numbers, and the undeniable fact that they were spending less than 2 minutes actually looking at the property before writing the citations. I recorded audio on my phone during every conversation, capturing their smug, rehearsed answers when I pressed them for specifics about the municipal codes. When the utility trucks arrived in the middle of the night to further tamper with my water lines, the infrared cameras caught the faces of the workers. I documented the distinct logos on their trucks, which did not belong to the city at all, but rather to a private third-party, contracting firm frequently employed by my father's real estate development company. The puzzle pieces were falling into place perfectly. I created a massive digital dossier. I scanned every bogus citation, attached the corresponding video footage of the corrupt inspectors, and logged the exact timestamps of the vandalism and utility disruptions. I was building an ironclad, undeniable case of targeted corporate harassment, municipal corruption, and illegal property damage. My family thought they were waging a psychological war against a helpless, emotional dropout. They had no idea they were actively handing me the exact ammunition I needed to completely destroy their public reputation and dismantle their entire corporate empire. I reviewed the footage every single morning before the sun even crested the horizon. I watched the digital recordings of my brother's hired thugs slinking around my property in the dead of night. They wore dark hoodies and heavy work gloves, carrying out their petty destruction with the sloppy confidence of men who believed they were completely untouchable. One piece of footage showed a man I recognized instantly. It was the head of security from my father's corporate office personally overseeing the cutting of my chain-link fence. The sheer arrogance of sending a direct employee to commit vandalism on my land proved how little they respected my intelligence. They genuinely believed I was too stupid to catch them. The physical toll of living in a combat zone was exhausting, but the mental clarity it provided was profound. I swept up the broken glass myself. I patched the holes in the fence with heavy gauge wire. I hauled buckets of water from a local commercial supplier just to flush the toilet and wash the dirt from my hands. I did not complain, and I did not let them see me sweat. Whenever Cameron drove his Porsche slowly past the property rolling down his window, to smirk at the lack of construction progress, I simply stood on the cracked asphalt and smiled back at him. I waved with absolute unbothered confidence. That smile infuriated him more than any screaming match ever could. It signaled that his attacks were failing. It signaled that I knew something he did not. Every night, the file on my hard drive grew larger. The digital folder labeled corporate sabotage became a meticulously organized weapon. I backed up the data to 3 separate secure cloud servers, ensuring that even if they managed to break into my office and steal my laptop, the evidence would survive. I was no longer just the scapegoat of a toxic family. I was the architect of their impending ruin, gathering the stones they threw at me to build the fortress they would soon crash against. The digital fortress I was building on my hard drive provided a profound sense of security, but the physical reality of my property was still an active battleground. Late Thursday afternoon, the dust had barely settled from yet another completely fabricated municipal inspection when a pristine black Mercedes SUV rolled slowly onto my gravel lot. It was not Cameron returning to throw another tantrum. The tinted windows glided down and a private driver stepped out to open the rear passenger door. A pair of immaculate beige designer stilettos touched the cracked asphalt. My mother Barbara had finally decided to grace the front lines of this corporate war with her presence. She stepped out of the climate-controlled vehicle wearing a perfectly tailored white linen suit, a string of heavy pearls around her neck, and oversized designer sunglasses that shielded her eyes. The visual contrast between her country club elegance and the raw industrial grit of my construction site was almost comical. She held a silk handkerchief delicately over her nose and mouth, as if the very air surrounding my property was toxic. She picked her way across the lot, stepping gingerly over chunks of broken concrete and the shattered glass that her husband's hired thugs had left behind just days earlier. I leaned against the rusted frame of a decommissioned gas pump, wiping grease from my hands with a shop towel, and waited for the performance to begin. "Oh, Fiona, my poor, poor girl," Barbara cried out, pitching her voice to carry a theatrical tone of absolute maternal heartbreak. She lowered her sunglasses, letting her eyes widen in manufactured horror as she took in the sight of my heavy work boots, my dusty jeans, and the sweat coating my forehead. She rushed forward with her arms outstretched, attempting to pull me into a tight embrace. I took a deliberate, calculated step backward, denying her the physical contact. Her arms fell awkwardly to her sides, but she did not drop the act. Instead, she transitioned seamlessly into a display of profound, overwhelming pity. "Look at what you have done to yourself," Barbara continued, her voice trembling with fake emotion. "You look absolutely terrible, Fiona. You are losing weight, your skin is ruined, and you are living in absolute squalor. This is a severe psychological breakdown, and it breaks a mother's heart to watch her child spiral into such total madness. I remained completely silent, letting her weave her twisted narrative. This was classic Barbara. She was an absolute master of psychological warfare, utilizing a weaponized brand of maternal concern to completely invalidate my reality. "Your father is losing sleep over this rebellion?" she sighed, placing a manicured hand over her heart. "Cameron is incredibly stressed, trying to manage the launch of the new resort while carrying the heavy burden of your public humiliation. We know you were upset about not getting the promotion, but this acting out has gone much too far. You are clearly suffering a mental episode. Living in a toxic dumping ground, playing in the dirt like a feral animal, it is deranged behavior, Fiona. You need professional psychiatric help, and you need to come back to the safety of your family." She reached into her expensive leather handbag and pulled out a crisp, familiar document folder. It was the exact same buyout contract Cameron had tried to force on me earlier in the week. She held it out toward me with an expression of deep, tragic martyrdom. "Sign the paperwork, Fiona," she pleaded softly. "Let Cameron bail you out of this financial nightmare. He is offering you a generous $50,000 out of the goodness of his heart. It is the only way your father will ever be able to forgive you for this aggressive hostility. Sign the deed over, come home, and let us get you the medical treatment you so desperately need before you ruin your life permanently." The sheer audacity of her gaslighting was breathtaking. My family had systematically orchestrated the destruction of my property. They had paid men to cut my fences and hurl bricks through my windows in the dead of night. They had leveraged corrupt municipal contacts to sever my access to basic utilities, forcing me to haul drinking water by hand just to survive the summer heat. They created the exact squalor and misery I was currently standing in. And now my mother was pointing at that exact same misery as undeniable proof of my supposed mental instability. They were trying to convince me that my resilience was a symptom of insanity. I looked at the contract in her hand, then looked directly into her eyes. Did Dad's blood pressure spike before or after he paid those private contractors to smash my convenience store windows? I asked, my voice calm, level, and entirely devoid of emotion. Did Cameron lose sleep on the night he bribed the city zoning board to illegally disconnect my water line? Or was that just part of his stressful resort launch? Barbara gasped sharply, taking a step back as if I had physically struck her. The mask of the caring, distressed mother slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing the cold, calculating woman beneath. "How dare you accuse your father of such thuggery?" She snapped, her tone instantly losing its syrupy warmth. "You are completely paranoid. This toxic environment is poisoning your brain." I did not take the bait. I simply watched her carefully analyzing the situation with the precise logistical mindset she and my father had always underestimated. Why was she actually here? Why the sudden desperate push to get my signature today? My family did not care about my mental health, and they certainly did not care about forgiving me. Then the realization hit me with brilliant clarity. The mega resort. Cameron had announced the $250 million project, and the initial press cycle was over. The next logical phase in high-level commercial real estate development was the site walkthroughs. Harrison and Cameron were undoubtedly scheduling massive catered tours for their elite investors and foreign backers to view the valley in person. They needed to show off the pristine landscape where the luxury estates and cascading waterfalls would soon be built. But to access that valley, a fleet of luxury town cars carrying the wealthiest investors in the state would have to drive directly past my property. My family was completely terrified. They were not scared for my well-being. They were absolutely paralyzed by the fact that I was a visual blight on their upcoming luxury project. Having a dilapidated gas station at the main entrance occupied by the CEO's estranged, defiant daughter who refused to be bullied was a catastrophic public relations nightmare. It completely shattered the exclusive multi-million-dollar illusion they were trying to sell to their backers. Barbara was not here to save me from ruin. She was here to save their aesthetic. I crossed my arms over my chest and let out a short, humorless laugh. "You can put the contract away, Barbara," I said deliberately, dropping the title of mother. "I am not signing anything, and I am certainly not accepting a pathetic $50,000 bribe to fix your landscaping problem. You and Harrison can bring every single investor you want down this highway next week, and they are going to see me standing right here on my property, completely unbothered by your cheap sabotage tactics." Her eyes narrowed into sharp, dangerous slits. "You are making a monumental mistake, Fiona," she hissed, her voice dropping into a harsh, threatening register. "You are declaring war on your own blood. We will completely ruin you. We will ensure you never work in this state again. You will be penniless, homeless, and entirely forgotten." I stepped forward, towering over her despite her designer heels. I was covered in dirt, sweat, and motor grease, but I had never felt more powerful in my entire life. "We stopped sharing blood the moment you let Harrison strip away my future to stroke Cameron's fragile ego," I replied, my voice ringing with absolute lethal authority. "I am not your scapegoat anymore, and I am not your victim. I own this land. You are currently trespassing on private commercial property. Get back in your car, get off my lot, and never show your face here again." Barbara stared at me, her chest heaving with suppressed fury. She realized in that exact moment that the psychological chains she had used to control me for 33 years were completely broken. The quiet, obedient logistics manager was dead. In her place stood a woman who could not be manipulated, guilt-tripped, or terrorized into submission. She shoved the contract back into her designer handbag, spun around on her stiletto heel, and marched back to her waiting SUV. The driver hurriedly opened the door, and she slid into the back seat without looking back. I watched the black Mercedes pull away, kicking up a trail of dust as it merged back onto the highway. The emotional tie to my family, a bond that had been fraying for years, was finally permanently severed. I felt no grief, no sorrow, and no regret. The psychological warfare they had waged against me had completely failed. They thought they were breaking me down, but they had simply stripped away my remaining fears, leaving behind a cold, untouchable armor. I turned my back on the highway and walked toward my office. It was time to stop playing defense. It was time to gather my newfound capital, hire a shark, and spring the trap that would bring their entire empire crashing down to the ground. I did not waste a single second after Barbara drove her luxury SUV away from my property. I marched directly into the back office, locked the heavy metal door, and called Victor. He was the high-end Americana broker who had originally appraised the contents of the hidden vault. I told him I was ready to liquidate a significant portion of the remaining collection immediately. I explained that I needed maximum capital, and I needed the transaction to occur entirely off the radar. Victor was a consummate professional who thoroughly understood the value of absolute discretion in the private collector market. He arrived the very next morning before sunrise, driving a pair of unmarked climate-controlled box trucks, accompanied by a highly efficient, trusted crew. For 6 straight hours, we meticulously wrapped and loaded the rarest and most valuable pieces from the vault. I sold off a series of pristine porcelain dealership signs, a perfectly preserved 1950s diner jukebox, and 3 original gas pump globes that were practically considered holy grails in the automotive collector community. Victor did not ask any probing questions about why I was rushing the sale or why we were operating in the dead of night to avoid the corrupt city inspectors. He simply verified the authenticity of the vintage items, finalized the private transfers with his anonymous buyers overseas, and initiated the wire transfer. By the time the sun set over the dusty highway, my corporate bank account had swelled by an additional $400,000. My family honestly thought I was a destitute dropout crying in the dirt, completely unaware that I was sitting on a massive, highly liquid war chest. I now possessed the exact financial firepower required to engage them in the very arena they thought they controlled. I just needed a gladiator to wield it. I knew exactly what kind of legal representation I required to execute my plan. I did not want a polite corporate mediator or a traditional family lawyer who would try to push for an amicable settlement behind closed doors. I needed a relentless, independent predator who specialized in tearing apart arrogant corporate developers. I spent 2 solid days scouring public legal records, searching for attorneys who had successfully defeated massive eminent domain claims and exposed zoning board corruption. One name kept appearing at the top of the most brutal commercial victories in the state: Lincoln. He was a former corporate defense attorney who had defected to start his own independent commercial litigation firm. His reputation was legendary in the real estate sector. He was known for being abrasive, highly strategic, and utterly ruthless when dismantling corporate bullies. I called his office, bypassed his paralegal by mentioning the exact parcel number of my property and the name of my father's firm, and secured an emergency meeting for that exact afternoon. Lincoln operated out of a sleek minimalist office in a repurposed industrial loft downtown. When I walked in carrying a heavy waterproof briefcase, he was sitting behind a thick glass desk reviewing a stack of commercial building permits. He was a sharp, calculating man in his late 40s who did not bother with basic pleasantries. He looked up from his paperwork and immediately asked why the daughter of the biggest commercial developer in the city was trying to hire him instead of using her father's army of corporate lawyers. I sat down across from him and laid out the entire situation without a single shred of emotion. I detailed the stolen promotion, the gas station purchase, the weaponized city inspectors, and the targeted vandalism orchestrated by my own family. Lincoln listened impassively, his face a complete stone wall. Then I opened my waterproof briefcase. I slid the thick stack of original 1990s commercial deeds, the mineral rights, and the exclusive water table grants across the glass desk. I watched his eyes scan the yellowed parchment. The skepticism melted from his face, instantly replaced by the predatory gleam of a lawyer who realized he had just been handed a loaded weapon. Lincoln spent the next 4 hours dissecting the historical documents and cross-referencing them with the public filings for my brother's newly announced eco-resort. He pulled up zoning maps, municipal water regulations, and environmental impact reports. When he finally looked up from his computer monitor, he leaned back in his leather chair and let out a short, sharp laugh. He told me that my family had committed an error so arrogant and so catastrophically stupid that it would be taught in law school classrooms for the next decade. He turned his monitor to face me, displaying the glossy investor prospectus for Oasis Valley. Cameron had already pre-sold tens of millions of dollars in luxury residential plots to elite buyers. The entire marketing campaign was built around the explicit promise of 3 massive artificial lakes, an 18-hole championship golf course, and lush, tropical landscaping in the middle of a dry valley. Lincoln pointed to the fine print of the engineering report. To build and maintain those massive water features, the resort required a staggering amount of local water access. My father and brother had arrogantly assumed that the subterranean aquifer belonged to the municipal government and that their bribed city council members would simply grant them unrestricted drilling permits. But municipal authority only applied to unclaimed surface water. The deep subterranean aquifer, the exact water source they absolutely needed to pump to fill those artificial lakes, was legally bound to my specific parcel of land. Lincoln explained the severe magnitude of the legal trap. Because I held the grandfathered exclusive water rights, it was physically and legally impossible for Cameron to deliver on a single promise he had made to his high-rolling investors. If Cameron attempted to drill a single well anywhere in that valley, he would be committing a massive federal violation and stealing private resources. The entire luxury resort was built on a legal house of cards. They were taking millions of dollars in pre-sale deposits for waterfront properties that could never actually exist. Lincoln stated that their actions were bordering on corporate wire fraud. He looked at me and asked what exactly I wanted to do with this information. He told me we could send a cease and desist letter right now to halt their construction and force them to the negotiating table. I told him absolutely not. If we warned them privately, my father would use his immense wealth to try and outlast me in court, bleeding me dry with endless delays, while quietly refunding the investors to cover his tracks and save his public reputation. I wanted maximum public accountability. I wanted them completely exposed in front of the exact people they were trying to impress. Lincoln smiled a cold, highly calculated grin that confirmed I had hired the right man. We spent the next 3 days drafting a comprehensive bulletproof legal injunction to halt all development in the valley. We prepared certified notarized copies of the water rights and the historical deeds. We documented the chain of title perfectly, ensuring there were zero legal loopholes for my father's corporate lawyers to exploit. We filed the injunction quietly, sealing it under a specific commercial dispute clause that kept it off the immediate public radar until we were ready to serve it to the opposing counsel. The trap was officially set, and the jaws were locked wide open. We knew exactly when we were going to drop the hammer. In exactly 2 weeks, Harrison and Cameron were hosting a massive black tie groundbreaking gala at the most expensive and exclusive ballroom in the city. Every major politician, every elite socialite, and every single lead investor who had poured millions of dollars into Oasis Valley would be in attendance. It was meant to be Cameron's crowning achievement, the night he officially cemented his legacy in the commercial real estate world. Instead, it was going to be the night I publicly dismantled his entire empire piece by piece. I transferred a massive retainer fee to Lincoln's firm without blinking an eye, shook his hand, and walked out of the downtown office. I drove back to my gas station, pulling onto the gravel lot just as the sun began to set. I stood by the rusted pumps and watched the fading light cast long, dark shadows over the expansive valley that I completely controlled. The harassment from the city inspectors and the vandalism no longer bothered me. It all felt incredibly small and insignificant now. I had the financial capital to survive anything they threw at me, and I had the legal firepower to destroy their future. All I had to do now was wait patiently for the night of the gala and watch my family walk blindly onto the stage they had built for their own corporate execution. The 2 weeks leading up to the gala required a completely different kind of preparation than the grueling physical labor I had grown accustomed to at the gas station. I had spent the last month covered in thick layers of construction dust, dried concrete, and heavy engine grease, hauling water-damaged drywall and breathing in the sharp scent of aged asphalt. Tonight required a completely different type of armor. I stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in the luxury penthouse suite I had rented for the occasion, smoothing my hands down the sides of a custom-tailored midnight blue silk gown. It was a dress that commanded absolute, undeniable authority, purchased with a fraction of the liquid capital I had secured from Victor earlier that week. I paired the gown with understated but incredibly expensive diamond earrings and a sharp, elegant updo that pulled my hair tightly away from my face. I did not look like a hopeless failure. I did not look like a disgruntled, emotional dropout crying in the dirt. I looked like a woman who owned the entire room before she even stepped foot inside it. Lincoln met me in the hotel lobby promptly at 7 o'clock. He wore a razor-sharp charcoal suit carrying a slim leather briefcase that held the nuclear codes to my family's entire commercial empire. We rode in the back of a hired black town car in total focused silence. The venue was the Grand Heritage Ballroom, the most opulent and historically significant event space in the downtown financial district. As we pulled up to the valet stand, the sheer staggering scale of my father and brother's hubris was on full public display. Massive industrial floodlights illuminated the historic stone facade of the building. Dozens of valets scrambled frantically to park a continuous shining stream of Bentleys, Maseratis, and armored SUVs. Thick red velvet ropes guided the city's absolute elite through the towering brass front doors. My family had spared absolutely no expense to celebrate a massive corporate victory they had not actually secured. We walked past the ticketing podium with the quiet, unbothered confidence of people who completely belonged there. The ballroom itself was a masterpiece of modern corporate excess. Enormous crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over hundreds of guests, dressed in strict, impeccable black tie attire. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos glided smoothly through the dense crowd, carrying heavy silver trays piled high with beluga caviar and crystal flutes of vintage champagne. In the absolute center of the room stood a massive, brightly illuminated architectural model of Oasis Valley. It showcased the sprawling fictional artificial lakes, the cascading waterfalls, and the vibrant green golf courses that would never actually see a single drop of local water. I scanned the massive room and instantly spotted them. Harrison and Cameron were standing near the front of the main presentation stage, completely surrounded by a thick, eager circle of the city's most powerful politicians and heavy-hitting institutional investors. They were laughing loudly, shaking hands vigorously, and slapping backs. Cameron was holding a heavy crystal glass of expensive scotch, regaling a group of wealthy foreign backers with a story I was absolutely sure he had completely fabricated. He looked entirely in his element, playing the role of the conquering hero of the commercial real estate world. A few feet away, my mother Barbara was holding court with the wives of the city council members. She was wearing a glittering silver designer gown, smiling her perfectly rehearsed vacant smile, completely oblivious to the impending destruction of her social standing. I took a deep breath, letting the cool air-conditioned air fill my lungs, and stepped directly into the main thoroughfare of the ballroom. I did not try to blend in. I did not stick to the shadows along the walls. I walked with slow, deliberate, heavy steps straight toward the brightly lit center of the room. It did not take long for the ripple effect to begin. The wealthy guests closest to me stopped talking mid-sentence, their eyes drawn to the midnight blue silk and the absolute icy confidence radiating from my posture. As I moved deeper into the crowd, the silence spread outward like a sudden freezing wave. Barbara was the very first member of my family to actually see me. She was mid-laugh, raising her champagne flute toward a local politician's wife when her eyes locked onto mine across the sea of black tuxedos. The crystal glass slipped a fraction of an inch in her hand, spilling a few drops of expensive sparkling wine onto the polished hardwood floor. Her jaw went completely slack, all the color instantly drained from her perfectly manicured face, leaving her looking pale and terrified. Harrison noticed his wife's sudden shock and followed her wide-eyed gaze. When he saw me standing there looking like an absolute queen rather than the filthy, defeated mechanic he had left in the dust weeks ago, his expression morphed rapidly from jovial triumph to pure, unadulterated panic. He blinked rapidly, clearly struggling to reconcile the reality of my powerful presence with the pathetic narrative he had sold to everyone in the room. He leaned over abruptly and slapped Cameron hard on the shoulder, pointing discreetly in my direction. Cameron spun around, spilling a splash of scotch onto his own wrist. The arrogant, victorious smirk immediately melted off his face. For a split second, he looked exactly like the terrified, incompetent little boy he truly was when stripped of my father's corporate protection. But that brief flash of fear was quickly replaced by a vicious, humiliated rage. My father did not hesitate or attempt to approach me diplomatically. He abandoned his circle of wealthy, confused investors, leaned over to a burly man wearing a covert security earpiece, and frantically gestured in my direction with a sharp, aggressive chop of his hand. 3 massive, broad-shouldered private security guards immediately broke away from the perimeter walls. They began moving aggressively through the parted crowd, making a direct line toward me. Their intent was incredibly clear. They were going to grab me physically by the arms, drag me out the back service doors, and throw me into the dark alley before I could utter a single word to their precious financial backers. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. I stood my ground perfectly still, my chin held high, waiting for the impact. But before the lead guard could even extend a heavy hand toward my shoulder, Lincoln stepped swiftly and smoothly directly in front of me. He did not raise his hands in a defensive posture or shout in a panic. Instead, he reached inside his tailored breast pocket and produced a thick, neatly folded stack of legally stamped documents. He shoved the paperwork directly into the broad chest of the lead security guard, with enough sudden force to make the large man stumble backward in surprise. Then Lincoln turned his body slightly so that his voice would carry not just to the aggressive guards, but to the rapidly quieting circle of elite investors, who were now watching the unfolding drama with intense, morbid curiosity. "Do not touch my client," Lincoln ordered, his voice booming with the lethal, resonant authority of a man who routinely destroyed massive corporations for a living. His tone sliced easily through the soft jazz music and the anxious, murmured whispers of the packed ballroom. You are currently attempting to physically assault Fiona, the legal and fully documented owner of the primary commercial property bordering your proposed development site. She is a recognized legitimate stakeholder in this exact district. As a neighboring commercial landowner, she has a federally protected documented legal right to be present at this public zoning and environmental impact announcement. If you lay a single finger on her, I will personally ensure this hotel, your private security firm, and the host of this gala are hit with an assault and discrimination lawsuit so massive it will permanently bankrupt your grandchildren. The private security guards froze instantly in their tracks. They looked helplessly back toward the stage, completely paralyzed by the highly credible threat of catastrophic legal action. Harrison's face turned a deep, dangerous shade of purple. He took a heavy step forward, his hands balled into tight fists at his sides, completely desperate to maintain control of the rapidly deteriorating room. The wealthy investors surrounding him were no longer smiling or raising their glasses. They were exchanging wary, highly suspicious glances. In the high-stakes, ruthless world of commercial real estate development, severe public legal disputes at a groundbreaking gala were a massive, glaring red flag. Wealthy backers despised unpredictability, and I had just injected a massive dose of legal chaos directly into the main artery of their celebration. Cameron shoved his way forcefully past the paralyzed security guards, his expensive linen suit wrinkling as he marched aggressively up to us. He tried to lower his voice to a threatening, venomous whisper, desperate to keep the nearest institutional investors from hearing the absolute panic vibrating in his tone. "What the hell do you think you are doing here?" he hissed, a thick vein throbbing dangerously in his forehead. "You are trespassing on a private event. You do not belong in this room. You do not belong in this society, and you are going to leave right now before I have the actual police arrest you for criminal harassment and corporate espionage." I looked at my brother with a gaze so incredibly cold and hollow it could have frozen boiling water. I did not raise my voice to match his frantic energy. I did not display a single ounce of the emotional distress he so desperately wanted to see. I simply smiled a slow, razor-sharp smile that promised absolute impending devastation. "I am not going anywhere, Cameron," I replied calmly, my voice perfectly steady and clear enough for the entire front row of high-net-worth investors to hear every single syllable. "I received your lovely presentation notes regarding the new luxury eco-resort. I just have a few minor logistical questions about your supply chain. Since you are the brilliant vice president of operations, I figured tonight would be the perfect time to ask them in front of your entire financial backing." Cameron practically leaped onto the stage, adjusting his expensive tie with practiced arrogance. He tapped the microphone, a slick, practiced smile spreading across his face. He launched into his presentation, pacing the stage like a tech CEO unveiling a revolutionary new product. He gestured expansively toward the massive digital screen behind him, which displayed a breathtaking three-dimensional rendering of Oasis Valley. "Look at this masterpiece, ladies and gentlemen," Cameron announced, his voice echoing through the opulent ballroom. "We are not just building luxury homes. We are creating a self-sustaining, eco-friendly paradise in the heart of the desert." He clicked a button on his remote, and the screen zoomed in on a massive, crystal-clear artificial lake surrounded by lush tropical landscaping. The crown jewel of this development is our innovative state-of-the-art water management system. We will be pumping millions of gallons of pristine subterranean water to sustain these magnificent lakes, a championship golf course, and the sprawling gardens of our exclusive waterfront estates. It is a triumph of modern engineering and visionary development. The wealthy investors in the room nodded approvingly, murmuring their appreciation for the grand, ambitious scale of the project. My father Harrison stood near the front row, his chest puffed out with absolute pride, completely oblivious to the legal landmine his golden child was actively stepping on. Cameron continued his boastful presentation, making explicit, legally binding promises to his financial backers about the resort's water features, entirely unaware that he was committing public corporate fraud. When the presentation concluded, Cameron opened the floor for a brief question and answer session. Several investors asked polite softball questions about projected completion dates and environmental impact studies, which Cameron answered with slick, rehearsed corporate jargon. I waited patiently until a lull in the questioning. Then I casually stepped away from Lincoln and approached the sleek silver microphone stand positioned in the center aisle. I adjusted the microphone slightly, the sharp screech of feedback cutting through the polite murmurs of the room. Every eye in the ballroom instantly turned toward me. I leaned forward, my voice cool, level, and ringing with absolute lethal authority. I just have one minor logistical question regarding your brilliant eco-friendly water management system, I said, staring directly into Cameron's suddenly terrified eyes. How exactly do you plan to supply millions of gallons of subterranean water to a $250 million luxury resort when you do not legally own the water rights to the valley? The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. You could have heard a pin drop on the thick carpet. Cameron's slick, arrogant smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sheer panicked comprehension. He gripped the edges of the podium, his knuckles turning white as he stared down at me. "Excuse me," Cameron stammered, his voice suddenly weak and uncertain. "Who let you in here? This is a private event for serious investors." My father practically lunged out of his front row seat, his face a terrifying shade of crimson. "Turn off her microphone!" Harrison roared, pointing a trembling finger at the sound technician in the back of the room. "Security, remove this woman immediately. She is a disgruntled former employee attempting to disrupt a private corporate event." I did not flinch. I did not step away from the microphone. I simply raised my hand, and Lincoln smoothly stepped into the aisle beside me. He did not speak. He did not yell or threaten. He simply reached into his slim leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. With the quiet, predatory grace of a shark circling its prey, Lincoln began moving efficiently through the front row of the ballroom. He handed a certified, notarized copy of the 1992 grandfathered commercial deeds directly to the lead institutional investor, a stern-looking man who represented a major foreign banking conglomerate. He then handed copies to the city council members, the local politicians, and every other major financial backer seated in the VYP section. "These documents are a matter of public record," I announced, my voice carrying clearly over my father's frantic shouting. "They are certified copies of the original commercial deeds for the 800-acre valley where you are currently planning to build Oasis Valley. If you turn to page 4 of the addendum, you will see the explicit irrevocable transfer of all subterranean water and mineral rights." The wealthy investors quickly flipped through the documents, their expressions morphing from annoyance to severe sudden alarm as they read the dense legal jargon. As you can see, I continued, my gaze fixed firmly on my brother, who looked like he was about to vomit directly onto the podium. "The rights to the subterranean aquifer do not belong to the municipal government. They do not belong to Harrison's commercial real estate firm. They belong exclusively, permanently, and irrevocably to me." A collective horrified gasp rippled through the ballroom. The lead institutional investor stood up, his face a mask of furious indignation. He waved the legal document aggressively in my father's direction. "Harrison, what is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice cracking like a whip. "Are you attempting to pre-sell luxury waterfront properties without securing the basic water rights? Have you committed corporate fraud?" My father looked like he had been struck by lightning. He stammered frantically, trying to formulate an excuse. "There has been a misunderstanding," he pleaded, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "A clerical error at the county zoning office. We were assured the rights had reverted to the city decades ago. We can resolve this quietly." "A clerical error?" I interrupted, my voice dripping with pure, unadulterated contempt. "You failed to perform basic fundamental due diligence on a $250 million project. You were so arrogant, so blinded by your own hubris that you assumed you could simply buy the surface dirt and drill your wells without checking the historical chain of title. You assumed the rules did not apply to you." I turned away from my father and addressed the room of investors directly. "I want to be incredibly clear with everyone in this room. My family's firm does not own the water. They cannot drill a single well. They cannot build an artificial lake. They cannot water a single blade of grass on that luxury golf course. I hold the absolute legal authority over the entire water table, and I have absolutely no intention of granting them access. Lincoln stepped forward, handing a final document directly to my father. And just to ensure there is no confusion regarding my client's legal standing, Lincoln announced, his voice booming with authority. We filed a preemptive emergency legal injunction with the State Superior Court this morning. A judge has officially signed an order halting all commercial development, excavation, and construction in the valley until this dispute is resolved. Oasis Valley is legally dead in the water. The ballroom descended into absolute chaos. Investors were shouting, politicians were frantically whispering to their aides, and the carefully constructed illusion of my family's corporate invincibility shattered into a million pieces right in front of my eyes. I had exposed their arrogance, their incompetence, and their reckless disregard for legal procedure on the biggest stage possible. The hopeless failure they had discarded had just dropped a legal nuclear bomb on their entire empire. The chaos in the grand ballroom was deafening, a roaring wave of panicked voices and frantic movement. Wealthy investors were shouting across the tables, their faces twisted in confusion and outrage. Politicians were urgently pulling their aides aside, whispering frantically into their ears. The carefully constructed illusion of my family's corporate invincibility had shattered into a million pieces right in front of my eyes. Suddenly, a sharp, piercing screech of audio feedback cut through the uproar. Cameron had shoved his way past our father and violently snatched the microphone from the podium stand. His chest was heaving and his expensive tailored linen suit was completely soaked in patches of nervous sweat. The polished, charismatic vice president had vanished entirely. In his place stood a cornered, vicious, and utterly terrified man. He screamed into the microphone, his voice cracking with unchecked rage. He commanded the crowd to ignore me. He pointed a trembling finger in my direction, branding me a jealous, unstable dropout who had spent her entire life deeply resenting his success. He shouted that I was a hopeless failure who had foolishly purchased a toxic dump on the edge of town and was now attempting to extort her own flesh and blood out of pure malicious spite. He paced the stage like a caged animal, insisting that my documents were fabricated and that the legal injunction was a desperate, pathetic scam designed to ruin his monumental night. Harrison frantically grabbed Cameron by the arm, trying to physically wrestle the microphone away from his golden child. My father knew perfectly well that in the ruthless world of high finance, a public emotional meltdown was just as lethal as a bankrupt balance sheet. But Cameron shoved his own father aside with surprising force. He continued his unhinged tirade, his face turning a dangerous mottled shade of purple. He assured the terrified investors that he would have my injunction thrown out by a judge first thing tomorrow morning. He loudly boasted that he possessed the power, the capital, and the municipal connections to squash me like a bug and clear the valley for development by any means necessary. He was digging his own grave with every single word, and I did not lift a finger to stop him. I simply stood my ground in the center aisle, my posture perfectly straight, my midnight blue gown catching the light of the massive crystal chandeliers above. I waited patiently for him to run out of breath. I waited for the echo of his frantic, desperate shouting to fade against the velvet-draped walls of the opulent ballroom. When Cameron finally paused, panting heavily into the microphone and wiping sweat from his forehead, I looked over at Lincoln. My attorney gave me a single crisp nod. During the initial wave of confusion, Lincoln had smoothly and deliberately maneuvered his way to the main audio-visual control desk positioned at the edge of the stage. The hotel sound technician, utterly bewildered and terrified by the unfolding corporate disaster, offered zero resistance when Lincoln firmly unplugged the primary auxiliary audio cable from the presentation laptop. Lincoln stepped down from the stage and handed the long black cable directly to me. I caught the cord and plugged it into the headphone jack of my phone. I looked up at my brother, who was staring down at me with a mixture of profound confusion and dawning terror. I did not raise my voice to match his frantic energy. I did not hurl insults or defend my character. I simply tapped the screen of my phone and hit play. The pristine high-definition audio from my hidden trail cameras immediately overrode the entire ballroom sound system. The recording was crystal clear, amplifying through the massive concert-grade speakers surrounding the venue. Cameron's own voice filled the expansive room. It was not the slick, rehearsed corporate tone he had used for his grand presentation just moments ago. It was the cruel, arrogant sneer he had used when he stood on my dusty lot and threatened my livelihood. The recording played loudly for every single investor, socialite, and politician to hear. The audio captured Cameron explicitly bragging about his corrupt municipal connections. The entire room listened in stunned, breathless silence as the digital version of my brother boasted about bribing the city zoning board. They heard him proudly detail his exact strategy to weaponize city inspectors, fabricate obscure code violations, and illegally sever my water and power lines to bankrupt me. They heard his unmistakable vicious threat to leverage his political influence to condemn my property via eminent domain simply to remove a visual inconvenience from his resort entrance. I watched the faces of the city council members and local politicians sitting in the VIP front row. The color drained from their cheeks in absolute unison. They were suddenly staring down the barrel of a massive federal corruption scandal, and their names were attached to the host. A few of them did not even wait for the recording to finish playing. They stood up abruptly, knocking over their expensive crystal champagne flutes, and practically sprinted toward the side exit doors. They were completely desperate to distance themselves from my family before the local press got wind of the bribery allegations. The audio clip ended with the sharp, violent sound of Cameron slamming his car door and speeding away from my gas station. I disconnected my phone from the cable and slipped it gracefully back into my clutch. The silence that followed the recording was absolute and suffocating. It was heavier and more profound than the silence that occurred when I first presented the water rights deeds. This was the silence of total irreversible destruction. The lead institutional investor, the stern-looking man representing the foreign banking conglomerate, slowly rose from his chair. He buttoned his tailored suit jacket with deliberate shaking hands. He looked up at the stage, his face twisted in a mask of pure, unadulterated disgust. He did not yell or lose his temper. He spoke with the chilling, calculated precision of a man who controls hundreds of millions of dollars in capital. He informed my father that his banking conglomerate operated under a strict zero-tolerance policy for corporate fraud, municipal bribery, and criminal extortion. He declared that my family's firm had egregiously violated their fiduciary duties and breached every single ethical clause hidden within their funding agreement. He announced loudly and unequivocally that his firm was withdrawing all capital commitments and pulling their entire financial backing effective immediately. He promised Harrison that their elite legal team would be filing a massive, crippling lawsuit for fraudulent misrepresentation and breach of contract first thing in the morning. The lead investor turned on his heel and marched down the center aisle, signaling for his entire financial team to follow him. His departure acted as the ultimate catalyst. The dam officially broke. The rest of the grand ballroom erupted into a frantic, chaotic exodus. Wealthy investors, elite socialites, and corporate backers scrambled wildly out of their seats. They pushed past each other, rushing toward the heavy brass front doors of the hotel. Absolutely no one wanted to be associated with a sinking ship, especially one actively anchored to a severe criminal bribery scandal. The mass exit was swift, brutal, and entirely merciless. Heavy wooden chairs were overturned in the panic. Silver trays of expensive appetizers were knocked to the floor by fleeing guests and trampled under expensive leather dress shoes. I looked toward the side of the room where my mother had been standing. Barbara stood completely frozen near the VIP section. The elite country club wives she had spent her entire life trying to impress were actively avoiding her gaze as they hurried past. They pulled their expensive wraps tightly around their shoulders, treating my mother like a walking contagion. Her carefully curated social standing, the only thing she truly valued in this world, evaporated into thin air in real time. She looked small, terrified, and utterly alone. I stood completely still in the center aisle, letting the panicked crowd part around me like rushing water flowing around a solid stone. I looked up at the main stage one last time to survey the damage. Harrison was gripping the edges of the wooden podium, his knuckles stark white from the pressure. His chest heaved erratically as he surveyed the rapidly emptying ballroom. The massive, beautiful three-dimensional rendering of Oasis Valley still glowed brightly on the digital screen behind him, serving as a cruel, mocking reminder of the empire he had just permanently lost. He looked entirely broken, suddenly appearing years older and incredibly fragile. Cameron was standing beside him, completely paralyzed. The microphone slipped from his limp fingers, hitting the wooden stage floor with a loud, final thud that went entirely ignored by the fleeing crowd. His eyes were wide, glassy, and fixed on absolutely nothing. The golden child, the supposed future of the family legacy, had single-handedly orchestrated the total annihilation of their company. His arrogance had cost them everything. Lincoln stepped to my side, smoothly snapping the heavy brass clasps of his leather briefcase shut. He gave me a brief, highly satisfied smile. He nodded toward the exit, signaling that our work here was officially done. I did not say a single word to my father or my brother. I did not demand an apology or gloat over their ruin. They were simply not worth another second of my time or my breath. I turned my back on the crumbling stage, hooked my arm confidently through Lincoln's, and walked out of the grand ballroom with my head held high, leaving my toxic family completely alone in the absolute ruins of their own making. The fallout from the groundbreaking gala was immediate, catastrophic, and completely irreversible. By 9 o'clock the following morning, the financial markets had reacted violently to the news of the botched water rights. The lead institutional investor, true to his word, officially withdrew his entire funding commitment and issued a blistering public statement citing profound ethical concerns and gross negligence regarding my father's firm. The local news stations picked up the story by noon, running sensational headlines about the spectacular collapse of Oasis Valley. Within 48 hours, a massive avalanche of lawsuits hit Harrison's desk. The wealthy buyers who had placed multi-million-dollar deposits on non-existent waterfront estates filed immediate breach of contract claims. Environmental groups previously silenced by my father's political connections seized the opportunity to file injunctions against any future development attempts. The city council members who had attended the gala practically tripped over themselves, rushing to publicly distance their careers from Cameron and Harrison. They immediately launched an internal audit to investigate the bribery allegations captured on my audio recording, desperate to save their own political skins. The commercial real estate firm that my father had spent his entire life building, the same firm that had discarded me like garbage, was pushed to the absolute brink of total bankruptcy in less than a week. The rapid hemorrhaging of capital was staggering. Lenders froze their credit lines, contractors halted work on other projects due to unpaid invoices, and the value of their commercial portfolio plummeted as the taint of scandal spread. They were actively bleeding out on the corporate floor, and they had absolutely no tourniquet left to apply. Exactly 14 days after the gala, a familiar subdued black SUV turned onto the freshly paved asphalt of my property. It was not speeding aggressively like Cameron's Porsche, and it did not carry the arrogant swagger of my mother's previous visit. It crept onto the lot with the hesitant, defeated pace of a vehicle carrying passengers who knew they were walking into an execution. I was standing near the newly installed commercial electric vehicle charging bays, reviewing an electrical schematic with my site manager. The transformation of my property was well underway. The rusted canopy had been replaced by a sleek, modern solar array. The convenience store was fully gutted, its interior humming with the sound of power tools and busy construction crews installing high-end fixtures for the new boutique travel lounge. The contrast between my thriving, active business and the utter ruin my family was currently facing was stark and undeniable. The SUV doors opened slowly. Harrison, Barbara, and Cameron stepped out into the bright afternoon sun. They looked absolutely ravaged by the stress of the past 2 weeks. My father's usually impeccable posture had crumpled. His shoulders sagged beneath his wrinkled suit jacket, and deep dark circles shadowed his eyes. Cameron looked like a ghost of his former self, pale, unshaven, and vibrating with a jittery, nervous energy. My mother, completely devoid of her usual haughty elegance, clutched her handbag tightly against her chest, her face pale and drawn. They approached me slowly, carefully navigating around a pallet of fresh paving stones. I did not stop my conversation with the site manager. I deliberately made them wait, forcing them to stand awkwardly in the sun while I finished discussing the voltage requirements for the charging stations. Only when I was completely satisfied with the electrical plan did I turn my attention to the three broken people standing on my property. I crossed my arms and looked at them, my face a mask of absolute neutrality. I did not offer a greeting. I simply waited for them to speak first. Fiona. My father began, his voice raspy and devoid of its usual booming authority. His eyes darted nervously around the bustling construction site, taking in the undeniable evidence of my massive financial investment. We need to talk, please. I remained completely silent, letting the noise of the power drills and heavy machinery answer for me. The silence stretched between us, thick and uncomfortable. We made a mistake, Harrison finally choked out the admission, clearly tasting like ash in his mouth. A terrible, catastrophic mistake. We underestimated you, Fiona. I underestimated your business acumen, your strategic thinking, and your resolve. I was wrong. It was the closest thing to an apology I had ever heard from the man, but it rang entirely hollow. He was not apologizing for treating me like a disposable servant for years. He was not apologizing for stripping away my promotion or casting me out of the family. He was solely apologizing because I had outplayed him and cornered his entire empire. Cameron shifted uncomfortably, his eyes fixed firmly on the ground. He looked like a cornered animal, completely stripped of his bravado. "We are facing total ruin," Fiona, he mumbled, his voice tight with barely suppressed panic. "The lawsuits are burying us. The banks have frozen our accounts. If we cannot resolve this water rights issue immediately and salvage the Oasis Valley project, the firm will be forced into Chapter 11 bankruptcy by the end of the month. We will lose absolutely everything." My mother suddenly stepped forward, her eyes wide and brimming with desperate theatrical tears. She reached out, attempting to grasp my arm, but I took a sharp step backward, maintaining my strict physical boundary. "Oh, Fiona, please," Barbara cried, her voice trembling dramatically. "You cannot do this to us. We are your family. Blood is thicker than water. You have proven your point. You have shown us how smart and capable you are. Please, sweetheart, you have to sell us the water rights. You have to save your father's legacy." I looked at the woman who had recently told me I was deranged and begged me to accept a $50,000 bribe to disappear. Now she was pleading with me to save the very legacy she had previously barred me from participating in. The sheer blinding hypocrisy was staggering. I let out a short, cold laugh that cut right through my mother's performative sobbing. "Blood is thicker than water," I repeated, my voice dripping with pure, unadulterated contempt. "That is a very interesting philosophy, Barbara. Where was that deeply held belief when you and Harrison cut off my health insurance and officially disinherited me over an $800 steak dinner? Where was that profound family loyalty when Cameron was bribing city inspectors to illegally condemn my property and bankrupt me?" My mother flinched as if physically struck, her tears suddenly drying up as the reality of my words hit home. Harrison stepped forward again, holding up his hands in a desperate, placating gesture. "Fiona, name your price," my father pleaded, his eyes wide with raw desperation. "We will pay you anything you want for those grandfathered deeds. We can secure emergency bridge financing if we show the lenders that we have legally acquired the subterranean rights. We will buy the deeds from you at a massive premium. $2 million. $3 million. Just name the figure. We need to secure the valley today." I looked at the three of them, truly taking in the pathetic sight of my powerful family reduced to begging in the dirt of the property they had mocked me for buying. They honestly believed they could just write another check and make the problem vanish. They believed that money was the ultimate solution to the catastrophic mess they had created through their own staggering arrogance. "I am not selling you the water rights, Harrison," I stated calmly, my voice ringing with absolute unyielding finality. "I am not selling you the deeds, I am not selling you the mineral rights, and I am certainly not selling you a single drop of water from that aquifer." Cameron's head snapped up. his eyes widening in pure, unfiltered horror. "You cannot be serious," he gasped, his voice cracking with panic. "If you do not sell us those rights, the firm goes under. Dad loses everything. I lose everything. You are deliberately destroying your own family out of pure spite." "I am not destroying anything, Cameron," I replied coldly. "You destroyed the firm the second you decided to pre-sell waterfront properties on land you did not legally control. You destroyed the legacy when you prioritized your fragile ego over basic fundamental due diligence. I am simply refusing to bail you out of the burning building you set on fire yourself." Harrison's face turned a dangerous shade of pale. He recognized the immovable reality in my tone. He understood, perhaps for the first time in his entire life, that he possessed absolutely zero leverage. He could not intimidate me, he could not fire me, and he could not buy me off. I held all the cards, and I was holding them very, very close to my chest. "So what do you want, Fiona?" my father asked, his voice a defeated, hollow rasp. "If you won't sell, what are you demanding from us?" I smiled, a slow, calculated expression that held no warmth whatsoever. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed a number I had pre-programmed. I put the call on speaker, letting the ringing echo across the construction site. Lincoln answered on the second ring. "Lincoln," I said, clearly my eyes fixed on my father. "Are the lease documents prepared for Mr. Harrison's review?" "They are finalized and ready for signatures," Fiona Lincoln's voice replied, crisp and professional through the speaker. "I can have a courier deliver them to the site within 20 minutes. I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket. I looked at the three bewildered faces standing in front of me. "I am not going to sell you the water rights," I repeated smoothly. "But I am willing to lease them to you. I am willing to grant you highly restricted metered access to the aquifer so you can build your precious little resort and appease your furious investors. But you are going to do it entirely on my terms. And I promise you my terms are going to cost you substantially more than just money." The courier arrived precisely 20 minutes later, riding a sleek black motorcycle. He handed me a thick manila envelope sealed with Lincoln's firm logo and sped off down the highway. My father, mother, and brother watched my every move as I broke the seal and pulled out the crisp, heavy legal documents. I did not invite them into my air-conditioned office. I kept them standing right there in the oppressive afternoon heat, on the very dirt they had mocked me for purchasing. I unfolded the contract and held it up. I told them that Lincoln had meticulously crafted an irrevocable 99-year commercial lease agreement for metered access to the subterranean aquifer. I was not granting them ownership. I was becoming their permanent, unyielding landlord. The first condition was a massive, non-refundable, upfront capital injection of $10 million payable directly to my newly formed holding company by the end of the business day tomorrow. Harrison gasped, his hand flying to his chest, as if he had been physically struck. He stammered that securing $10 million in liquid capital within 24 hours would require liquidating his personal assets and leveraging his own private estate to the absolute limit. I looked at him with zero sympathy and told him that sounded like a personal logistical problem, not a commercial real estate issue. The second condition, I continued flipping to the next page of the thick document, dictated that my holding company would receive 15% of the gross annual revenue generated by Oasis Valley in perpetuity. Not net profit, where their creative corporate accountants could easily hide money behind administrative fees, but gross revenue from every single luxury villa sold, every golf club membership activated, and every night booked at the resort. I was effectively turning their $250 million vanity project into my own personal passive income generating machine. I would reap the massive financial rewards of their labor without ever having to attend a single board meeting or deal with a demanding investor. Cameron stared at me, his mouth hanging open in absolute shock. He told me I was out of my mind and that they would never agree to such blatant extortion. I smiled a cold, razor-sharp smile and told him he had not even heard the final condition. I turned to the very last page of the contract, which required a separate, highly specific individual signature. I looked directly at my brother and watched the arrogant defiance slowly drain from his eyes. I told him that the absolute non-negotiable prerequisite for my signature on the water lease was his immediate legally binding and permanent resignation from the family firm. He would surrender his title as Vice President of Operations, forfeit his shares in the company entirely, and sign a strict non-compete clause preventing him from operating in the commercial real estate sector anywhere in this state for the next decade. The silence that slammed into the construction site was heavier than the heavy machinery idling in the background. Cameron looked like he had been physically struck by a speeding freight train. He turned to our father, his eyes wide and frantic, begging Harrison to tell me this was impossible. He pleaded that he was the face of the legacy, the chosen successor, and that the company could not possibly survive without his visionary leadership. He grabbed Harrison by the arm, frantically demanding that they walk away and fight me in federal court to prove I was extorting them. I simply stood there and let the agonizing reality wash over the man who had stolen my promotion and laughed at my independence. Harrison did not look at his golden boy. He did not comfort him or offer a reassuring counter-strategy. Harrison was a ruthless businessman above all else, and he was currently doing the brutal cold calculus of sheer survival. He looked at the lease agreement in my hand, then looked at the massive empty valley behind me that represented his impending financial doom. If he fought me in court, the firm would be bankrupt within 30 days, his legacy completely destroyed, and his personal wealth seized by furious investors to cover the breach of contract lawsuits. If he signed my contract, the firm would barely survive. The resort would eventually be built, but he would lose his son and surrender a massive chunk of his future profits to the daughter he had discarded like trash. Harrison slowly pulled his gold fountain pen from his breast pocket. He turned to Cameron, his face hardened into a mask of pure corporate survival. He told Cameron to sign the resignation immediately. Cameron staggered backward, tears of genuine panic welling in his eyes. He screamed that this was a total betrayal, looking to our mother for salvation. Barbara stood completely paralyzed in her designer heels, her hands covering her mouth, absolutely powerless against the ironclad legal trap I had sprung. She realized that saving her social standing meant sacrificing her favorite child, and she chose her social standing without hesitation. Harrison stepped forward, his voice a low, terrifying growl. He told Cameron that his arrogance and his sloppy failure to perform basic due diligence had put the entire family on the brink of total annihilation. He grabbed the resignation document from my hand, shoved the gold pen into Cameron's shaking fingers, and ordered him to sign his professional death warrant. Watching my brother's tears fall onto the legal paper as he signed away his entire career was the most profound, deeply satisfying moment of my life. Harrison snatched the signed resignation, quickly signed the lease agreement himself, and handed the entire stack back to me. He did not say a single word. He turned around, got back into the black SUV, and waited for his ruined son and weeping wife to join him. I watched them drive away completely broken and permanently banished from my empire. Fast forward 2 years. The rusted, abandoned 1990s gas station is nothing but a distant memory. In its place stands an absolute masterpiece of modern commercial ingenuity. I took the massive upfront payment from the lease agreement and poured it directly into realizing my ultimate vision for the property. My land is now a highly lucrative state-of-the-art boutique travel oasis and commercial electric vehicle charging hub. Sleek, solar-powered canopies stretch across the freshly paved lot, sheltering dozens of high-speed charging stations. The old convenience store has been completely transformed into a luxurious glass-walled cafe, serving artisanal coffee, fresh local cuisine, and offering high-speed internet for affluent travelers. Because my property sits directly at the sole entrance to the newly completed Oasis Valley Mega Resort, I capture an enormous captive audience of wealthy tourists, elite golfers, and luxury homeowners every single day. The sheer brilliance of the setup is that my business perfectly complements the resort they built. The elite guests of Oasis Valley stop at my hub to charge their expensive electric vehicles and purchase high-end goods before heading through the grand resort gates. And every single month, like clockwork, my holding company receives a massive multi-million-dollar wire transfer, representing my 15% cut of the resort's gross revenue. I am generating astronomical wealth from a project I do not have to manage staff or maintain in any capacity. My father's company built the resort. They manage the day-to-day headaches they deal with, the demanding luxury clientele and the constant facility upkeep, and I sit back and collect a fortune simply because I own the water flowing beneath their feet. I am fully financially independent, immensely successful, and completely free from the toxic expectations that defined my entire childhood. I sat on the pristine, sun-drenched patio of my travel oasis, savoring a perfectly brewed cup of coffee. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the faint scent of the desert blooming around the artificial lakes in the distance. Lincoln sat across the small iron table from me, reviewing a quarterly earnings report on his tablet. He wore his usual sharp suit, a relaxed, victorious smile playing on his lips as he read the staggering revenue numbers out loud. We had become close friends over the past 2 years, bound together by the flawless execution of the greatest legal maneuver of our careers. We clinked our coffee cups together in a silent, comfortable toast to our continued staggering success. As I took a sip, a vehicle caught my eye on the main highway leading away from the city. It was not one of the sleek armored SUVs or shining sports cars that typically frequented the resort entrance. It was a beat-up, faded sedan with a dented bumper and a sputtering exhaust pipe. The car rolled slowly past my property, stopping for a brief moment at the intersection before merging onto the interstate. Through the dirty, unwashed window of the driver's side door, I saw a familiar profile. It was Cameron. He looked tired, noticeably older, and completely stripped of his former arrogant glory. Without the family firm to prop him up, without his father's unlimited credit card, and entirely blacklisted from the local commercial real estate sector due to the brutal non-compete clause he signed, he had faded into complete obscurity. He glanced over at my thriving modern enterprise, his face a mask of bitter, impotent regret, before staring straight ahead and driving away into the dust. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or guilt. I simply took another sip of my coffee and looked out over the empire I had built with my own 2 hands. My family had told me I was a hopeless failure for buying a piece of forgotten toxic dirt. They had laughed at my ambition and tried to bury me under their corporate machine. But sitting there in the bright sunlight surrounded by my own undeniable success, I knew the absolute truth. I had taken the very dirt they mocked and turned it into an untouchable fortress, proving once and for all that true value is never simply inherited from a toxic legacy. True value is dug out of the ground, fought for, and uncovered by those brave enough to swing the sledgehammer.